So this session is going to have the same pattern as the previous two. There are going to be two academic talks and one kind of practitioner reaction. So we're very happy to have, for the academic talks, for the practitioner, we're very happy to have Pierre-Martin Houet, Senior Vice President of Sustainable Development and Impact at Michelin. And for the academic talks, we're delighted to have Patricia Crifo, an expert in CSR, Professor of Economics at the École Polytechnique and their research institute, CREST. And the final researcher is myself, who you've already met. I'm the academic director of the Inclusive Economy Center. So we had a little discussion on who goes first. It was decided that I'm going to go first, so I will go first. So, product social information, that's what this session is about. That's what my talk is going to be about. I'm going to start taking a step back with a citation from a book that maybe some of you know. It was a New York Times bestseller by the anthropologist David Graeber. And this is kind of the leitmotif of the book, this idea that putting things in monetary terms impersonalizes interactions and exchanges, thereby kind of crowding out morality, right? And if in a certain sense, you can think of that as one way of putting one of the main challenges of the Inclusive Economy Center, anyone who's interested in kind of business and social impact, kind of how you can reconcile the kind of monetary business exchange with not forgetting the morality or the social dimension, okay? Or what I'm going to call social characteristics in this talk. Now, firms have interactions with various stakeholders, investors, employees, suppliers. We're going to be talking about consumers here, product labeling, okay? And there's a whole bunch of product labels. You're going to see many others later on. We kind of all know them. And in a certain sense, one way of reading what's going on here is an attempt to put some morality back in the exchange, right? And when you talk to people, and this is one of the reasons why we're entering this session, kind of, since I've been in charge of the Inclusive Economy Center, I've repeatedly heard stories about how, is there any point? Do consumers care? Is this sort of information useful? All that type of stuff. So this is what we're going to be talking about here, right? We're going to be asking kind of two practical questions. Giving any form of information about social characteristics of products to consumers, is there any point in doing that? Why would you do it? And if there is a point in doing it, how would you do it? Okay? What was the most effective way of doing that? Now, these are practical questions, but given that I'm supposed to be one of the academics here, I'm going to look at these questions from a research perspective. Okay? And underlying these questions is essentially a question about people's pro-social attitudes. When they're in a position where they're exchanging money for something, do they have any attitudes towards the social characteristics of that thing? Okay? That's going to be my first research question. And if they do have such attitudes, what does that mean for the impact of any information about those social characteristics at a society level? Okay? So what I'm going to try and do is I'm basically going to be trying to talk about these practical questions. I'm going to have to take a bit of a detour via these research questions. Okay. Now, I'm going to try and go relatively fast, but to treat a question like this according to the kind of standards in some of the fields that I'm coming from, in particular behavioral economics, you would like an incentivized study. So that's a study where you don't ask people, do you care about social stuff? So it's a study where you get people to put their money where their mouth is, right? You give them a choice between something which is socially good, but costs a little bit more, and something which is socially bad and costs a little bit less, and see whether they're willing to pay a little bit more for the social good, okay? Now, the problem with such incentivized studies in this domain is it's actually quite difficult to find products where we know information on social characteristics. If you were interested, I don't know, in tracing some human rights violations down a supply chain, it's hard to find that sort of information for enough products to be able to run an incentivized study, because you need to know this for all the products you're going to be, or at least for enough of the products you're going to be offering people. There is one, perhaps not the only one, but there is one social characteristic where that information is typically available. And that's income inequality across the workforce. Why is that available? You may or may not know, but after the financial crisis, part of the Dodd-Frank laws in the US made it obligatory for publicly listed firms to report this, right? They have to report basically the ratio of their CEO salary to the median salary, okay? And that legislation, that also exists in the UK, it exists in France, it's part of the CSRD. So this is something we have some information about. So we could find products and we'd be able to say something about the income inequality across the workforce. And that's a social characteristic. This project is bigger than just this social characteristic, but that's an example where we can get this information so we can run a study. Notice just in passing, by the way, although it's available, people don't know much about it, right? So this red slide, this is from another work by someone else. This red area is supposed to be what people think this current state of inequality is. This gray area is what the current state of inequality is. So it's information that we can get, but people haven't already interiorized. So what do we do? This is the kind of the research bit. I'm trying to answer kind of part of these why and how questions. We did the sort of incentivized studies I talked about, right? So we basically gave people choices between a good where the inequalities differ, Dodd-Frank inequalities in this case differ, the prices differ, and by kind of cooking up those questions appropriately, we can work out, we can basically elicit from people how much they're willing to pay for a reduction in inequality from this value to this value. And we incentivize this, so people got towels. If they said they were willing to pay more, they got less change from their budget. And we did this on representative samples in England and the US. That's all I want to talk about, the kind of sciencey bits of research, but I'm very happy to talk to the academics about that afterwards. What do we find? Are people willing to pay for reduced inequality? Well, overwhelmingly, yes. Okay? So what this graph shows you is the willingness to pay, mean willingness to pay, over our samples, according to political leaning. I'll say something about that in a sec. So the most striking and surprising for us finding was how widespread positive willingness to pay was. Right? When given this choice, this kind of abstract choice with no marketing, no pizzazz, no kind of colors, no brands, when given the abstract choice, 80% of subjects were willing to pay something for some reduction in inequality. And most surprisingly to us, this happened across the political spectrum. So we did the US study after the 2020 US election. Trump voters and Biden voters were both willing to pay something. Some of them were willing to pay a little bit less than others, but they were both willing to pay something. This contrasts with surveys where you ask people on their opinions on, for example, redistribution. You're going to find huge polarization across the political spectrum. Here, there's much less. So this is the first answer to our why question. Why? Because effectively, the attitudes are there, right? If we peel back all the kind of marketing stuff, the attitudes are there, which basically means if the information is given in the correct format, the correct way, we're going to change consumer behavior. Right? The second part of our why question was, what effect is that going to have on a society level? Right? From a research point of view, we need different tools to deal with that question, a little bit of theoretical modeling. In another paper, we've plugged these preferences into a model. We turned on information, then we turned it off to work out whether there was a difference. What does it do? It's going to reduce inequality at the society level, not the level of individual firms, but the society level. And it's going to improve what economists use to measure how good the society is, society level well-being. Okay? So why? Because people have these attitudes deep down, right? Psychological fact. And not only that, if we had the information, these attitudes would have a positive effect on society. My second question was the how. The second practical question was the how question. So let's just say one or two things about that. And again, this study has some research findings which could be relevant for the how question. So firstly, note how much, this is no reduction in inequality. This is just a reduction from a very high level, which you saw in the previous slide, to a high level. And notice how the willingness to pay jumps up here and then kind of stays either completely flat or increases much slowly here. Right? that suggests that people react much stronger to the bad cases than they do to the good cases. This, by the way, is something you know if you've spent too much time in airport bookshops or flicked through Kahneman-style Thinking Fast and Slow books. There's a whole kind of cottage psychology literature on something called loss aversion, the fact that people have a stronger reaction to the negative than they do to the positive. This is exactly the same thing. Okay. So it's better to have information about the bad guys than it is to have information about the good guys. Second point, this comes from the modeling exercise. It would be better if you had information about everyone rather than information being voluntary, because only the good guys would give their information. Put those two things together, kind of scientific findings, have a practical consequence. It would be better to have information available for all products, what I call universal information provision. Second take-home message. So what you see here is, again, same experiment. We did various bits, or same paper at least. We did various bits. Here we gave different formats of inequality. So this blue line, that's the Dodd-Frank format you saw before, right? See how much the CEO earns more than earns. So it's relatively simple to understand. There are more complicated formats to measure inequality, that's for sure. But it's objective, more or less. Everyone understands more or less what it means for someone to earn 750 times or 5 times more than someone else. Okay? The red line, that's a kind of letter format. So think Nutri-Score. Think the type of format you find on energy efficiency on your washing machines or whatever. Or maybe your tires, I don't know. There we are. These sorts of formats here, I mean, you can see there's a big difference in willingness to pay between the two. Right? Which suggests that objective, simpler formats, when they're understandable, are more impactful, higher willingness to pay, and therefore higher effect. More informative, this is kind of follow-up surveying. More informative, it's considered more understandable, and typically preferred. Okay? Which suggests that, as far as possible, you would want to use comparable, objective, simple information. That's what you would want to be conveying. So let's just put these two things together. These are the kind of consequences that come out of this research. This is what you would want if you wanted to communicate social information about products, and we already said there's reasons to do so. This is what we currently have, and clearly these violate both of these, right? They're entirely voluntary. Okay? They typically are singling out the good guys, not the bad guys. And they are closer to A to E things than objective, simple, CEO earns this much more than the median one, right? There's quite a lot kind of packed into all of these. Some of them are even company specific, so they're not very comparable. This would not be how you would want to convey social information about products. A better way, something which is going to be closer to this, would be some sort of standardized scorecard, like a list, one as boring as possible in a sense, with objective factors that you can fill in for each product. And each product comes with this list with the factors filled in as far as possible. Okay. Now, this isn't something which is, this might ring some bells for some people in the room. It depends who we have. But the EU, for instance, are starting to do something like this. Sometimes it's called digital product passport, not for social criteria, not for social characteristics, but for some environmental ones. So an easy suggestion would be just to add social criteria, social kind of characteristics to that list. Let me just finish by saying one or two things that this would imply for the ecosystem of informing consumers. Right? If you want the information market structure, if I have to talk like an economist, okay? Clearly, these sorts of scorecards, the idea isn't that you have a kind of reams of paper that comes with every single product you buy, right? The idea is it's going to be electronic one way or another, and digital product passports would be like that. The idea is also clearly not, just in case you thought it was, that people are going to look these up directly, right? You might be worried if you've got kind of objective comparable standards that there are too many and they're difficult to understand. Okay? They're difficult to kind of There's so much information, it's difficult to take it all in. And that would have been a worry 30 years ago. But it's not necessarily a worry now, because we're living in a moment where we've become experts. There's tons of systems which have been set up to try and help us deal with an awful lot of complicated information about our products. I'm going to give you 3 examples, 3 kind of allegories, if you will, right? So you could think of this scorecard as basically a glorified nutritional table of the sort you find and you don't understand in the back of your cereal packet in the morning. We all know that there are apps, Yuka, Nutri-Score, whatever, that help you understand those things. And you can easily imagine, I don't know, the International Label Organization sets up one that says this is a product, this is a product which respects human rights down the supply chain, this one isn't. That's one option. We've all, I don't know if you break your phone as much as I do, but you've all had to buy some technical equipment, like a phone or a computer or a camera. And you've probably all had those situations where you don't know which one to buy, and you see these kind of huge lists of technical specs. Do I want a better camera? Do I want a longer battery? All that type of stuff. Well, these are more things to be added, right? I'm willing to pay a little bit more for a better camera, but I'm not willing to have child labor potentially being involved in the production of that camera. Final case, probably the most important one, recommendation systems. Right? Quite a lot of our purchasing comes via recommendation systems nowadays. They recommend stuff on the basis of what we've purchased in the past, the properties of what we've purchased in the past, and what we filtered out, right? Once we have this sort of information generally available for all products, that can be, that's something that AI systems naturally going to start using, right? That's something we're going to filter out. We're going to say, I don't want you to propose, I don't know, products with too much inequality involved in the production, or whatever, okay? Once you have that, the recommendation system isn't going to propose that, and it's going to tailor your recommendations to your tastes. Just to kind of, again, sorry, I'm kind of jumping between the kind of practice, trying to jump between the practice side and the kind of academic-y side, but just a remark about this market structure. One nice thing about it, I started with morality. Moral philosophy 101, rationality 101, you should keep, as far as possible, the facts separate from the values, right? If you want to make a decision, if you want to put 2 things together, your decisions will be based on some facts. You want to keep them separate from the values. This is the facts. Only saying inequality is this. It's only saying we know this much about, I don't know, child labor down the supply chain. It's only saying there's this much unionization among workers. But it's only saying whatever you want. These are the facts. This bit is the value bit. And the important thing about all of these is the consumer has a say, right? It's not like we're living in the myth that all consumers have the same values. Could well be that, you know, we have 100 people in this room. Each of us have different values. We're more moved by one thing than another. We think, I don't know, this dimension is more important than that one, right? This allows that, right? Whereas the current kind of practice mixes the two together, which is one of the problems, like one of the criticisms of it. These guys are trying to solve the problem of getting the data and deciding what the values are for everyone. Let me just, how much time do I have? 5 minutes. Thank you. So Octavio is saving us because, but I'm going to take even less than 5 minutes. So I'm just going to add one other kind of objection you sometimes hear about this sort of thing, right? Yeah, standardized scorecards, all good. No one's going to play on, right? You'll need to force an awful lot of companies to kind of give this data, okay? I'm going to call that the information gap problem. You have trouble getting that information, okay? No, it's pretty easy to deal with that problem when you think about it. Just tell people that the farm could have provided the information, but didn't. And if you want to give them a little bit of a ballpark, you can say, yeah, but a default value for this sort of farm in this sort of sector with this sort of size coming from this sort of region is a little bit like this. You can give an average value. You can be a little bit pessimistic and give a lower than average value if you want to, or worse than average value. What's going to happen? I mean, I can dig out scientific findings, but your intuitions are all going to be right on this. People don't like uncertainty. If information could have been provided and it wasn't, that's suspicious. If you give a default, which is typically bad, people are going to be close to it, right? You have a system like that, you're going to have an incentive for farms to provide information, right? Because clearly the good ones are going to want to provide it, the bad ones aren't. I could go beyond the scientific findings. I'm just going to just stop with one last thing. I talked about the case of attitudes to information, right? We're now talking about another case where we looked at something to do with information. This is a case that was run by a bunch of HEC students who were doing a clinique under my direction and that of Charlotte Mann with Schneider Electric. And they were trying to do something similar to what we'd done before, willingness to pay, but for human rights. And the problem with doing willingness to pay for human rights is there's not much information about human rights respect down the supply chain. So what did they ask? Instead of saying, this much is respected, this much isn't, they basically said, this is the amount of information which is given. Okay? I'm giving you no guarantees about human rights down the supply chain. I'm giving you guarantees that at least 50% of workers in the supply chain are free from forced labor. This is a forced labor. I'm giving you guarantees that almost everyone in the supply chain is free from forced labor. You see exactly what I was talking about. People don't like the lack of information. People do seem to have this pro-social attitude, not just for something like inequality, but also for something like human rights. Okay, so we're just going to stop. I'm just going to kind of wind up there. I've more or less said all of this. There's some research facts, okay, that answer practical questions. The research facts are there are underlying pro-social attitudes towards products. And if there was information about those about those social characteristics, that would have a benefic effect on the society level value of those characteristics. Okay? Moreover, what the research tells us is this is what we should be looking for as the properties of our way of communicating that information. What we're doing today has neither of these properties. A standardized scorecard does, can, and will. Thank you.
Patricia, how do I make this big?
Hi everyone, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to speak today after Brian and right before Pierre. I will talk about something quite complementary to what has said Brian, because I will mostly talk about the gap between intentions and actions. So you've talked about willingness to pay. The question then is, do they really pay more for such kind of attributes? And then I will relate these questions to some of my work on that. So I've just started with the notion of social product labeling, which was the title of the session. And I've been working a few years ago with Rodolphe Durand on this question of labels applied to finance products, because it's one category of product that has experienced a surge in labeling. And the social dimension was part of it. And so I've started with a general idea that the goal of those labels is to communicate on ethical and social and environmental standards, provide this information to consumers that is needed. And as Brian, I will go rapidly on it because Brian has talked a lot about it. Consumers really express a strong willingness to pay for those labels. And actually, if you apply it to financial products, in France in particular, which has been a pioneering country on that topic, there is a large amount of money invested on products that are labeled as social and environmental products. Not only social, it's a mixed label, but it's a general purpose label. But it's something that really attracts many consumers, and even informed consumers, I would say, because financial investors that invest in those labeled funds are really aware of the categories of products they buy. The problem, as I said in the introduction, is when we then not only ask consumers or investors to express their willingness to pay, but also when we put them in a situation to pay more or less for those kinds of goods, there is a large discrepancy between what they want and what they claim to be willing to do and what they actually do. So I've been working with some PhD students at Polytechnique on those topics. We have run some experiments, and we have documented these intention behavior gaps, especially applied to climate issues, but it's the same thing with social issues. Consumers repeatedly have problems in really taking their intentions to actions. Just to illustrate this, if you recall the 80% of consumers declaring that they would like to buy a labeled good, if you apply it to the market for organic food or the market for fair trade, okay, it's only 5% of market shares for coffee. But it's the same thing for fair trade. It never reached more than 10% of market shares, all goods concerned. So there is a large gap. What's interesting in this behavioral economics literature is that there are many explanations, theoretical, empirical, experimental exploration of this intentional behavior gaps. I have reproduced, I'm sorry, the slide is maybe not really easy to read. It's just an illustration. I'm not going to comment on the right hand side of the slide, but some researchers in psychology, as early as 15 years ago, Gifford has identified what he calls the psychological barriers to inactions, which is called the dragons of inactions. And this is something we know a lot in behavioral economics. There are many explanations for this gap: limited cognition, ideologies, comparisons with others, sunk cost, perceived risks, and so on and so on. So there are many rationalities behind that to explain why we all, even individually, we also talk about the schizophrenia of consumers who can take a lot their planes but buy organic food and so on. So, whatever you call it, there is this gap, and it is really persistent over time. So as an economist, I will, as Brian has mentioned, just illustrate some the theory of incentives. The main first tool that economists would like to investigate is incentives. There are many ways to incentivize people with using economic instruments. Okay, you can use public regulation, whether you call it carbon pricing, whether you call it bans on certain activities, regulation. But you can also focus on private self-regulation, which is more the soft law side of the problem, or co-regulation. And labels are actually part of that. Why do I call social labels or environmental labels as co-regulation forms? It's because to build those labels and to sell them, you can rely on public authorities, but most of the time it's private companies who deliver those labels. So it's a kind of public-private partnership to put these economic instruments in place. And the second types of the big categories of instruments economists look at is behavioral instruments. And it is very important to understand that when you resort to behavioral economics or psychology, then you have to take into account the beliefs of individuals. How do I consider the issue at stake? And Brian has really brilliantly shown how the perception, what information is given, is really important. If you apply it to climate change, okay, this is very important to give the right information to people about the consequences of climate change and so on. Also, social norms play a lot in this dimension, because adopting pro-social behavior really depends also on what the other does, okay? So you've mentioned loss aversion, but there is also inequality aversions, other regarding preferences, okay? You can want to be ethical, altruistic, or you can just want to do whatever the other do. So beliefs and social norms are very important. And the last point is inequality. All studies, most of the literature on addressing these intention behavior gaps shows, and even very large-scale surveys, like there's been a German study on 50,000 consumers, okay, all across Europe. So it's a very large-scale survey who has identified that people will be all the more willing not only to pay but really to act if they perceive inequality to be reducing. And that's exactly echoes what the results of Brian's studies, that as long as people see the efficiency, the equity, and the distribution of efforts evolving in the right direction, they are more ready to act. So I will go back to these two ideas, labels and inequality. So one solution, one economic incentive is to create labels. As I mentioned earlier, it's a co-regulation process which involves social product labeling, will involve many organizations. So it's a complex process, how those labels are formed. It involves government who provide their public good approach, ESG rating agencies and NGOs who also offer labels, but you also have union, you have institutional investors, all those different actors, private, public, and civil society, they all cooperate or try to, or lobby also, to provide those labels. So the market for labels is really a complex structure, and sometimes the equilibrium reached is not really efficient. Just to illustrate, it's not an exhaustive slide, okay? I can spend 10 slides with 10 different types of labels. Okay, you have labels in the agro-food sector, you have labels in the financial sectors, you have labels for energy efficiency, you also have them all over the world. In China, they have the same kind of label as we have in Europe, but even more precise because they give exactly the exact consumption of energy. You have many, many other labels. So when you see that, okay, it's just an illustration, but one question is it really efficient? And from the consumer perspective, okay? As a consumer, how do I know which label provides which information? This is totally obscure to me. Even as a, I would say, informed economist, I'm not really able to comment on all these labels. It's normal. The more label you have, well, at some point in time, too much label kills the labeling structure. Why? Because it creates more confusion. And the problem with creating this confusion is that, in principle, the essence of the label would be to simplify information, as Brian has mentioned, and to convey the right information. But a too complex structure will increase as information asymmetry rather than decrease it, and it will decrease the quality of the label because it will create counter-incentives. It's what we call the hidden cost of incentives. If incentives are badly tailored, then economic agents will have the tendency to lower their investment, to lower their effort, and to decrease the quality and the credibility of the label. So in the end, consumers will ultimately turn away from label. Or this is the French experience in the financial market. The French label for socially responsible products, the ESR label, okay, at the very beginning was really showing a sign of success. We were the most dynamic market for labeled socially responsible product. But then the quality of this label was really put at stake, and the government had to intervene. Only the public actor can intervene to dampen the market, and there were lots of pressure for tightening the label standard, and it took many years for that to happen, and the story is still ongoing. My second point, which echoes Brian's talk, is about inequality, because as Brian has mentioned, the CO to median wage is a very important information inside the firm structure, but because it really shows the level of inequality within a company, and it's an indicator that is comparable across time, across companies, across sectors. So it's a universal indicator, I would say. But it's the same thing with climate, okay? And the problem okay, the session is about social labeling, but I mean, we cannot disentangle social and environmental issues because both dimensions are cumulative, okay? People suffering from social inequality also suffer from environmental inequality. And people exposed to environmental risk are also exposed to social risk. So it's important to have in mind that those two dimensions are really intertwined and should be addressed all together. That's why my example focus on also on environmental policies, because I think it's an important question, especially applied to inequality. Okay, it's not only a matter of social inequality; it's really a matter of global inequalities. So the problem is that when you want to reconcile social and environmental dimension, okay, you say, okay, inequalities are cumulative. People suffering from energy precarity, I don't know if the word is correct in English, they also suffer from social inequality. How can we reverse the loop? And how can we reconcile energy transition with social justice, which is the goal of the just transition concept? Well, it's very difficult because there is this distribution issue. Environmental risks are not distributed equally. Okay, the poorest suffer the most from environmental risks. And also, so that's a notion of distributive justice, but there is another dimension of inequalities that is very important at the firm level, is the governance issue of inequality, which we call procedural justice, which illustrate the fact that people do not have access to the same opportunities to influence their decision concerning their environment, whether it is their societal environment, okay, their decision to buy, their decision to work, but also inside their company, if they are employed, all workers do not have the same possibility to influence their company. For instance, if they want their company to go green, they are not necessarily allowed to do that. So I don't know if I have lots of time left, 5 minutes, and I will spend the last 5 minutes on one concept that I think is important when addressing the social issue and the intertwine between the social and environmental issues, is the role of employees, the role of participative democracy, I would say, inside the company, to try to alleviate not only the distributive side of the problem, but also the procedural one, the governance aspect of these topics. How do we do that? We have regulation also, and in particular, regulation regarding employee participation. So what is employee participation? Or we can say co-determination or shared governance, is the idea to open the supervisory board of the company, the board of directors, to employees. That's very important because it gives the employees the opportunity to have a say, to have a voice in decision making, so to alleviate this procedural justice issue. And the literature in economy is quite mixed about that, because it's difficult to find, I would say, large-scale studies. There are many studies on the German case, because Germany was the first country in Europe to adopt the co-determination after World War II, but nowadays, like 20 countries in Europe adopt those kind of shared governance mechanism in which, okay, you open to workers the possibility to have a say in the governance structures. This is important for social labeling because all the companies who have social certification require worker participation. So it's one dimension of social labeling that is important. For instance, fair trade products require democratic decision making by producers, but it's also the case in many other social products. Is it a good idea? It can be a bad idea. Actually, we have to test that. And so, as I said, like out of 27 countries in Europe, 20 adopt it, and France was the last country to do it. So it's very interesting because we are always talking about the French model, but actually France is really a laggard in this process. For historical reasons, France has decided after World War II to transmit the decision rights to unions, not to workers, which is different. You have a difference between unionization and worker participation inside France. So France has decided really to professionalize, I would say, collective bargaining to unions, rather than having like a bottom-up democracy, real democracy inside the companies. So we are the last one to have done it. The evidence, the empirical evidence, is quite mixed. Actually, employee participation tends to have strong positive social impact, so that's a good thing. People working in companies with co-determination feel better at work, they quit less, they have higher wage and so on. But for environmental impacts, the evidence is quite mixed. Workers do not tend to really engage in those issues. And I will conclude at that. I think I have talked enough. One important dimension, so this is part of my recent research work on the topic, is once they are allowed to sit in the board of directors, what do workers do, actually? And is it efficient? So one of the main decisions they do is really that they try to incentivize managers on ESG topics, which is a very interesting finding, is that in all companies, in all European companies that have adopted worker participation inside the board, if those workers sit in remuneration committee, okay, if they are really allowed to make decisions, they will vote more generally for ESG bonus, so incentivizing managers for ESG performance. And this decision will have a very strong and causal impact on firm performance. So that's my last slide. Okay, the role of worker participation is really to have a say, and this say will try to put incentives on managers, and this will work. In companies that do not do that, that have worker participation without ESG bonus or ESG bonus without worker participation, the impact is negative or non-significant. So there is kind of a positive feedback loop between employee participation, social, I would say, welfare inside the company, managers correctly incentivized on ESG performance, and financial performance in the end. That's it. I finished on this topic.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you, Brian. So now I'm going to bring you from the high elevation of the human mind displayed by my academic colleagues to the very solid ground of planet Earth, which is more my daily life at Michelin. So we're going to look at the product social labeling. So very basic. We're looking at product, social, and labeling. Product. So first of all, I'd like you to spend maybe the first 2 minutes of your life thinking about this beautiful jewel, which is a Michelin tire. And you'll see why you need to think about this product when we talk about social labeling. So a Michelin tire is a high-tech product. We have more than 200 different types of materials that goes in it. When you drive on the highway, it deforms 10 times per second, and it will do that 50 million times during its lifetime. So think about it, you do that 50 million times. You carry 300 kg if you're on a car. You carry, I'd say, 35 tons if you're on an aircraft, A380. You carry 100 tons if you're a tire on a mining dumper. So it's a high-tech product. It's as well a safety product. It's the only thing that ties you to the road here. It's the size of my palm. When you want to brake, when you want to turn, this is what the Michelin tire does. It's a safety product. Sometimes it's the difference between life and death. So now that you understand that it's a very fancy product, much fancier than a phone, for example, let's relate a bit about your purchasing experience. What do you think when you think I need to purchase some tires? So it doesn't seem like the most enjoyable experience. So the three words that come when we ask people what do you think about purchasing tire is very difficult, stressful, intimidating. So I love purchasing tires when they are Michelin, but I'm probably one of the few people on this planet. It's important when it comes to social labeling. We'll see that in a minute. How much time you spend when you want to make a decision to purchase tires? When you purchase online, which is still a few percentage, you purchase sunglasses is roughly 26 minutes to think about it. A watch, 48 minutes. A bag, 3 hours. Earrings, 15 hours. So the good thing I don't wear earrings, so I save a lot of time. A tire is between 10 and 40 minutes. But most of the time you purchase the tire in a garage, in a point of sales, takes you 2 to 3 minutes. So keep that in mind as we are talking labeling. Social. So now I would like you to think of the social content of a tire, of a Michelin tire. What are the social stakes linked to manufacturing, distributing, using a Michelin tire? Are they low, medium, high? What kind? First of all, there's a lot of social stakes with our employees. We take care of 130,000 employees worldwide. We've deployed a living wage approach, ensuring a decent revenue for each of our employees, social protection. We train our people, 40 hours of training per year. It's twice as much as our closest competitor. We develop people during the lifetime so that they can take more and more responsibilities. 16% of our managers are starting as operators on the production line. So definitely we feel that there's a high social content we provide to our employees. Then on the value chain, we buy rubber, natural rubber, from more than 2 million farmers, mostly in Southeast Asia, Africa, South America. We purchase the rubber at a decent price. We have thousands of programs to support the training of those farmers, including environmental training so they can increase the productivity of their farm and reduce the environmental impact. So we have an impact there. There's a social impact. And then on the downstream value chain, the users, I said Michelin tires are a safety product. We have a social impact through the usage of our product. Worldwide, there's roughly 500 million people that drive during the year on Michelin tires, on a car, on a bus. And road is still the #1 cause of death for the youth. Here we're talking more than 1 million deaths per year due to road fatality. What is the link between road safety and the tire? It's huge. When you're driving on a wet road at 80 kilometers per hour, if you're riding on a Michelin tire, you will stop 80 meters before a low-graded tire. 80 meters, it's often the difference between life and death. So here again, we have a high social content, I believe. So what about labeling? So this high social content, how can we valorize it through labeling? So I see, and I was very glad to hear my colleagues talking of the possible impact of labeling as a way to make this ESG value visible by the consumer. Now, to stay on a very basic level, if we want that to have an impact, and before even talking about the impact of the labeling, it's extremely basic, but the label needs to be seen understood and trusted. And in the academic paper seems obvious, but in the reality, it's not. So I'll show you a few examples. So the first one is it has to be seen. So this is an example of a tire. It's not a Michelin one because we don't use this, this label. You see that label is FSC. So first of all, who knows the FSC label? Okay, so I think you're not at all a representative sample of the world population. So that's probably a bit biased. So FSC. Now, what is the chance? You spend 3 minutes buying a tire at a garage. What is the chance you see this FSC label? Knowing that most of the time you purchase a tire, you don't even see the tire. I mean, you talk to the guy or the lady, you say, okay, I want tires for my Volkswagen Golf. Okay, here you go. You want Pirelli? Okay, you go. Big mistake, but that's okay. And you don't see the label. So the first issue is really, how do we see the label? The second point is you need to understand the label. And here I love what Patricia showed us with all the different labels. This is the European labeling for tires for environment. We pushed a lot to have environmental labeling for tires. Now, when you look at the results, there's actually 5 criteria that are displayed on this label. Okay, can you name a few? Sound. Okay, you have a good eye. So this is the noise. Okay, energy consumption. This is the one. Braking here. Hey, you're good. You're good. So actually, you're in a store. You see that. So you understand it's about energy consumption. There's a gas pump here. You see C. Is C good? Is C no good? Actually, there's a huge difference between the A and the E tire. You're talking roughly half a liter of consumption per 100 kilometers. It's like €1 per 100 kilometers. You drive 40,000 kilometers. It's €400. It's for 4 tires. So it's €100 per tire. A Michelin tire is €150 roughly. So it's a huge payback. But do you understand that when you look at that? Not really. So the question of understanding the label is really key. And we had thought that the environmental part is easy because it's quantifiable. When it comes to social labels, very, very difficult to make it easily understandable. And then the third point is, you see the label, you understand it, do you trust it? Is it, and Patricia mentioned that, is it credible? And so I let you decide, but when you have an unknown brand with a fair trade label on it versus you have a Michelin tire, I mean, who do you trust? What do you understand? What choice you make? So to me, it's really the prerequisite to see, to understand, to trust. And then there's the big question of impact. What to measure? What is the real impact of the label? And when I look at our value chain here, and I take the example that Brian displayed with the ratio of the CEO to median salary to the medium worker salary, we are only talking about this part of the value chain. It's only one part. Is it representative of the social content of the product? It's questionable. Okay, so as a conclusion, I have to say that at Michelin, the choice we've made is to promote and nurture our brand, the Michelin brand, as the ultimate ESG label. We believe that when you have 2 minutes to make a decision on a product you unfortunately don't care about that much, what will make the difference is the brand. And you don't have time to look at, you were mentioning the scorecards, all criteria. I mean, in reality, and people who look at those scorecards, they're not researchers or engineers. And so we made the choice to promote our brand as the ultimate ESG label. So thank you. And ride safely on Michelin tires.
Can we ask questions? Yes. So recently, Michelin announced its engagement on the living wage. Did you see an impact on the sales in the following weeks, for example? I don't know.
No, so we didn't see any impact on the sales, unfortunately. There was a lot of communication around it that we didn't initiate. But the fact is that this communication arrived at the same time in a political context where there was a lot of debate about how much CEOs are paid. And there was this example from Carlos Tavares, whose ratio is probably the highest in the landscape. So there was a lot of communication. We didn't see any impact on the sales. And a few months later, we had to announce the closure of 2 factories in France that created a lot of communication in France and not elsewhere in the world. And that raised the question as well of what matters in terms of social content and what is the real impact of what we do. And the perception of consumers is often linked to one specific event that is not necessarily representative of the whole social impact we carry. But no impact on the sales, unfortunately. So hope that from the closing, the closure of the factories, no. So I hope that this conference today will have a huge impact. So I count on you. And you know, the question of willingness to pay that we see in the academic papers, I'm really pleased to see that there's some willingness to pay. When confronted to reality, it's not that easy to observe. You know, in the environmental labeling, our conclusion today is that there has been 0 impact of the European environmental labeling on the sector. In the last 5 years, the imports of cheap tires graded D&E has raised by 40% in the European Union. So willingness to pay, I'm a bit doubtful.
Since there's no noticeable impact of the labeling, I'm curious to hear, is it one of those 3 factors you mentioned about not being seen, not being understood, not being trusted? Or I was wondering if consumers even care. There is, see, understand, trust, but if I don't care, it doesn't matter.
Yes, definitely, I think it's part of it. And actually, Patricia, when you showed the percentage of the share of the fair labeled coffee, for example, which is around 5%, it's truly a question, do they care? I think they could care more if they understood more what is behind. So the idea of the CEO to median salary pay, I think, is something that people can understand. Will it change their decision? And the challenge we have in my industry is that the price difference is huge between a cheap imported tire and a Michelin tire, it's roughly twice the price to buy a Michelin tire. So when it and those are, I mean, you buy 4 tires, it's 600 euros. It starts to be a big amount. So you make, unfortunately, sometimes the wrong decision.
So I mean that's a great question, right? So that's why it's kind of important to separate the kind of underlying question of people's psychological attitudes from like more contingent elements, like what's the actual price difference in this particular market, how it's marketed, how visible it is. So the willingness, the incentivized willingness to pay studies suggests there are the underlying attitudes, but we might just be organizing our information ecosystem the wrong way to mobilize them. Right? So it's not surprising you can't find it with all of those, with like a slide like that of labels. It's not surprising you don't find much evidence of people willing to pay for those, because they don't really understand what they are. The question is rather, if you did things kind of, can we come up with ways in which we can, we can leverage people's kind of underlying attitudes in a better way, right?
Hello, thank you for your research and insights. That was really great. I had maybe 2 questions. The first one is, within your research or what you see on the ground with the tires, do you see differences between gender, social classes in terms of willingness to pay or intentions to pay? I don't recall exactly how you said it, Patricia. So do you see any differences?
Yes, so the gender issue is something like always coming out. There are some difference with respect to that. What we've done in our research paper is that to investigate an economic dimension that is not often researched in economy in this literature, is the risk aversion. Okay, people who are more risk averse are there also the one who are the less prone to act or not. And so we have very interesting results on that with real life experiments, because on the campus of Polytechnique in Palaiseau, we have a building which is an efficiency, high efficiency building. And so we have designed field experiments on the people living in these buildings, and we have sent them nudges to see if they change their behavior. So not only their intention, but really their behavior in energy consumption when they receive different types of information. And so we control for their various characteristics. And what we were interested in is not the socio-demographic characteristics, which is, you may have many surveys, I mean large-scale surveys. Here we are not on a large-scale population. So large-scale surveys insert the first part of your question, but on this field experiment, we did some economic experiments on their really altruistic behavior and risk aversion. So we have this because we thought it was interesting to model and measure climate risk from an individual perspective. Okay, how do people perceive climate risk compared to economic risk, general economic risk?
Yeah, so just 2 very small points. So we also find the kind of gender difference. That's kind of something that's more or less fine. I'm really happy to find out that people are looking at the impact of risk aversion. I think that's something that people haven't looked enough at. The other, the thing that we find with respect to willingness to pay for inequality reduction, that we find has the largest impact is people's opinion on how much inequality there is in the country they're living. And one funny thing is that that's typically dissociated from their opinion on the role of government with fighting inequality. That's why we find, kind of unlike most of the other literature, kind of that doesn't look at precisely consumer attitudes to inequality or inequality incentivized by not in a consumer position, but in the position of some sort of social planner. Different from that, we don't find that kind of people's attitudes to redistribution predicts their willingness to pay that well. right? It's as if the kind of that's a kind of tangential political question. What really counts is how bad they think the problem is. Right? That's so the two things which counter gender in that.
Thank you. I think it was very interesting to see your first two presentations about the different labels, and then and I'm going to speak like this because we talked before, is that it was a very good marketing presentation for Michelin, I think, your presentation. And the reason why I'm saying this is because it's interesting that we talked about trust and we talked about why we would go to like certain labels. And I'm wondering if the fact that Michelin said our only label is that we're Michelin, isn't that like going against what the whole presentation was about? Like, are we trusting Michelin that they are Michelin? Or why are we buying from Michelin? And I think that's interesting because the way that I saw it, and I'm not interested in tires, I don't have a car, and sometimes I'm thinking, but isn't Michelin just trying to be super social and so great and just saying like, we're great and that's why you should trust us? What is the difference between you guys not wanting to having any of those labels that people apparently trust or not? Why the decision of saying Michelin is so great that you should trust us because we're Michelin?
Thanks. Hey, you're so good, Brian. You're so good. Yeah, plant some flowers in a tire, that would be great. So I'll give you two answers. The first one, maybe I was not explicit enough in the presentation. We are not saying by Michelin. I mean, we don't use a social label. We use Michelin because we are above all of those things. Is we believe that the social label itself will have no impact because the Purchasing Act is very quick, that we see no impact from a well-structured environmental labeling. So we believe that the only way we can differentiate ourselves is through the brand, and the brand is associated to what we are doing now in terms of ESG, but what the roots of the company is. Because listening to you, it seems like it's kind of marketing fashion that I mean, Michelin, the social part has been at the heart of Michelin since the birth of the company. We were the first company in France to provide free medical care on site for employees. It was in 1902. So I'm a bit frustrated when I hear it's about marketing and fashion. It's about who we are.
No, I just wanted to compare what you said, Brian, with what you said, because you compared products that were absolutely similar. And so the only thing that differentiated is the social value of the product. Whereas when I buy tires, and I'm very interested in tires, there are many dimensions to the tire. Safety, of course, the price, the environmental impact, the social impact. And so I have to find a tire that has the same characteristic as the Michelin tire, and then I take into consideration the social impact. And so it's the difficulty and in my opinion, but I don't know anything about tires, they are all so different that it's difficult to compare them. And so is that this reason why you don't believe so much in labeling, because it's difficult to compare, or?
I think you're very right. We used to talk at Michelin about the total performance, which is this notion of exactly what you described. There's many characteristics that are taken into account when you choose a product. And there are performance, environmental performance, social, and it's very difficult to, and all tires from Michelin and all competitors, they display different balances in those characteristics. So how do you make this visible to the consumers and help the consumer make its informed decision? And that is very complex, because we see that here on environmental performance, we bring 5 criteria. On social, how do you display social performance? And then there is the intrinsic performance of the product, the mileage, the handling performance, weight, snow. So the act itself of choosing such a product is very complex. And we believe that adding additional information through social labeling can be even more confusing, actually. But this is